Thanks, Christy. Good morning, everybody. So just before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank my co-authors on this project. So Cassie Bushi was integral to all parts of this project, so a big thank you to her. And then Bob Christian and Ted Gooding used their many years of experience in the forestry industry to really guide and shape this report. And I also just wanted to thank the FCKP and the members of the technical committee who helped review and guide the project, and also to thank all those who did interviews for us as part of this project and gave up their time to provide their insight. So caribou in decline across Alberta in all caribou ranges except where predator control has stabilized populations. And you can see from this map on the right-hand side that caribou ranges really cover a large proportion, particularly of the boreal, but also some large areas of the foothills and the Rocky Mountains too. And caribou are designated as threatened by the Species at Risk Act, so at a federal level, and also by Alberta with the Wildlife Act. And habitat alteration or disturbance is really the kind of ultimate cause for these declines in most cases. And this comes through a number of different pathways. So one of these is that caribou simply require these large intact areas of mature and old forest. And when that type of habitat gets fragmented or lost, caribou stop using those areas, and that can lead to range contraction, and that makes those populations more vulnerable. And then we also have this really important effect called apparent competition, where we have habitat disturbance, things like clear cuts, for example, creating early cereal stage habitat. And that early cereal stage habitat provides forage species which are really preferred by ungulates like moose and deer and elk. And so those prey species then increase in abundance, and those species support predators, and particularly wolves. And so because you get more predators on the landscape, you also tend to get more incidental predation on caribou, and that can quickly reach unsustainable levels for caribou. And then of course, linear features in Alberta are really ubiquitous in the sense that we have seismic lines for oil and gas exploration pretty much all over the north of the province. And then we also have all sorts of road access for various activities, you know, oil and gas and forestry haul roads and recreational use and so on. And those linear features really help to facilitate predator movement, and particularly wolves, and allow those predators to move into caribou habitat more efficiently and have better access to caribou. And that means that there's an exacerbation of that predation effect. So forestry and caribou really overlap a great deal in Alberta. And this map on the right in the light green color shows forest management agreements. And then in the turquoise color, you have other types of forestry tenure, which is not a forest management agreement, but which is a significant size. And you can quickly see there's a huge overlap. Over half of boreal caribou range is under some form of tenure, and almost all of southern mountain caribou range, that's the herds, Red Rock, Prairie Creek, Alapesh, Narrowway, are also under tenure. And of course, forestry plays a really important economic role in Alberta and is a big employer, particularly in rural communities. And you could quickly imagine, just from glancing at this map, that staying out of caribou ranges, not harvesting in caribou ranges, would come at a huge cost. And so really that's why we're always looking for these opportunities to maintain what's often called a working landscape, i.e. one where you can have commercial forestry, but also still have caribou. And of course, that's a big challenge. So, you know, I've kind of mentioned there's lots of different industries, lots of different factors on the landscape which cause disturbance, but here we're focusing in on forestry. And so forestry can really cause this loss of mature and old conifer forest in the near term. And that means the loss of resources like lichens, which caribou rely upon. And so although these areas that are clear-cut will be reforested and should return to caribou habitat eventually, that does tend to take a really long time, many decades. And then we also see this increased abundance of early cereal stage vegetation on the landscape. And that really favors those other ungulate species and increases that predation effect on caribou. And then of course, we need that additional access to do forestry, haul roads and so on. And as I mentioned, that kind of access can exacerbate predation pressure on caribou. And so this project really looks to explore silviculture and alternative silvicultural systems which are not clearcutting, to ask whether there are opportunities to mitigate some of those impacts. And there's also ways of defining what silviculture is, but we like this definition from Vic Liefers, the theory and practice of controlling the establishment, composition, growth, and quality of forest stands to achieve the objectives of management. And I think this term, objectives of management, is almost purposefully vague in the sense that 30 or 40 years ago, those objectives would probably have been mostly to do with the timber supply, trying to harvest as much high quality timber as possible. But today, forestry is a lot more complex in the sense that we're managing for a lot of different values. And those are things like biodiversity, visual quality, and of course, caribou. And so what we were really looking to do is to reframe those management objectives for alternative silvicultural systems from a caribou perspective, and to ask whether there are any opportunities to use alternative systems to one, minimize that forage availability and habitat quality that you often get post-harvest that favors those moose and deer, and so reduce the effect of apparent competition. And two, to maintain or perhaps even improve caribou habitat attributes, that is, things like making sure that terrestrial or arboreal lichens are maintained after harvest, and ultimately whether caribou will continue to use an area post-harvest in the near term. So we interviewed a number of experts from both silviculture and kind of caribou biology, quite disparate fields. And we also did an in-depth literature review. And we identified some key case studies, particularly from British Columbia, Quebec, and Alberta, that we felt were informative. And we kind of wrap all this up into some recommendations for steps in Alberta that could be taken. So starting off in British Columbia, so on the map you see here on the western side in the purple area. So the purple area is the northern group of southern mountain caribou, and the Itcha-Ilgacha area there is on the West Chilcotin Plateau. And this is like quite a dry, relatively unproductive system. It's dominated by lodgepole pine. And there have been some really long-term trials in this area going back almost 30 years, looking at systems such as irregular group shelterwood, which I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, but it's a 50% removal over a 70-year rotation. And then also a group selection system, which is an even lower level of removal. And so that irregular group shelterwood system was really focused on trying to maintain attributes of caribou habitat, trying to maintain terrestrial lichens particularly, while the group selection one was more focused on arboreal lichens. And then over in the green area on the eastern side of this map in the Canal Highlands, we have this, we have the southern group caribou, and they're much more reliant on arboreal lichens. And so here in this particular area, the focus was more on the group selection system with the lower level of removal. But both of these kind of longer term trial areas were kind of originally focused more on these questions around caribou habitat itself and on lichen maintenance and so on, and less so on actual caribou response itself and on apparent competition of other ungulates. And so there's now studies at Mount Tom being conducted by UNBC researchers, and there the focus is much more on assessing how these other ungulate species react to these different systems, and also how caribou themselves respond. So first looking at this irregular shelterwood system, so kind of in its trial stages, it didn't really look like it does in the top left, but it was kind of operationalized into this checkerboard pattern for efficiency reasons. And in the top right photo, you see the interior of one of the cut areas of that checkerboard, and it's about 30 by 50 meters. And what you can see here is that the trees that surround this area really shade quite a lot of the cut area, and that provides some protection from excessive exposure for the terrestrial lichens in this system, and also allows them to regrow more effectively. And also kind of winter harvesting and careful harvesting was also used to kind of mitigate some of the mechanical damage as well. And then in the image at the bottom, you see one of these areas planted 20 years after being planted with lodgepole pine and hybrid spruce. And what I want to draw your attention to here in this photo is that there's really not much of an understory here. And in this particular ecosystem, which is, as I mentioned, quite unproductive, quite dry, they didn't see a lot of understory response. So in general, what we're seeing here is actually this system was pretty effective at maintaining terrestrial lichens, and there wasn't a huge understory response. But you can quickly imagine how if you did transfer this system, and think about that picture in the top left, to a lot of places in Alberta that are more productive, you'd probably be likely to create really good moose and deer habitat and see a lot of understory response. And so that really speaks to this need to consider how different systems will react in different ecosystems, and how you can have a very different impact depending on where you are. So moving on to the work at Mount Tom, you can see some group selection openings about 0.1 of a hectare here along the ridge in the photograph. And then in the foreground, there's a more conventional clear cut. And this system is quite effective at maintaining arboreal lichens. It doesn't move that much of the forest, ultimately, only about a third. But what's being seen here is that moose are really favoring these group selection openings. And it's not hard to imagine why when you look at this photo, because you see all this matrix in between the openings, which provides this kind of really nice thermal and security cover that moose like. And then you also, because this is a more productive system and it's wetter and you have more kind of plant growth coming back in those cut areas, you also have really good browse as well. And so that makes it a great moose habitat. And obviously that's quite concerning from the point of view of apparent competition, because we don't want to be bringing in those other ungulates into core caribou habitat. So some of the key points to take away from those BC case studies is, one, that there's really long-term data available from these partial harvest trials, and that's quite unusual, going back, almost 30 years in some cases. And it seems to be the case that you can definitely use various forms of partial harvest system to maintain those caribou habitat attributes, and particularly maintain lichens. But what is less clear is whether caribou really do continue to use those areas, and also what the effects are on apparent competition and how that varies depending on where and how you apply different systems. And I should also mention that there's been really large-scale implementation of these systems at Irregular over a really large area, and yet that herd has still declined pretty steadily since 2003. And there may be a number of reasons for that, and we don't really have the data to be able to disentangle those reasons, but certainly there have been big mountain pine beetle outbreaks which have complicated the picture. There's definitely still significant clear-cut harvest in winter range there, and there's also relatively high populations of other ungulates as well. So now moving on to Quebec. Quebec has a long history of alternative silvicultural systems, but of course, ecologically, it's very, very different to Alberta. And that really means that we can't make a lot of direct comparisons to Alberta ecosystems, but still we think there's a lot of value in looking to these studies and the work that's been done in Quebec, particularly from the point of view of maybe informing thresholds that may exist in terms of how much you can harvest without having a big response in the understory and increasing that apparent competition effect. And there's also experience in Quebec with zonation through the Triad project, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So just to briefly go through a couple of the studies that we review in this report. So in northeastern Quebec, there's a number of studies looking at selection cutting to preserve old growth forest attributes. And there's also some work done on aggregation, a little bit like some of the aggregation proposed in Alberta, where you have relatively large areas where you're cutting and then relatively large uncut areas that maintain that intact habitat for caribou. And then in western Quebec, you have some areas of these black spruce dominant forests, which are quite open. And there's been partial harvest trials there too, predominantly looking at terrestrial lichen maintenance, but also looking at understory response. And interestingly, in this system, that understory response is generally more dependent on the soil disturbance rather than on how much of the overstory you actually remove. And then in a very different area in the Gaspé Peninsula, you have these mountain ecotype caribou. And there's been all sorts of different systems trialed, selection and thinning and shelterwood. And again, historically, that's been more from the perspective of lichens and caribou habitat attributes. But more recently, there's been more focus too on predation and on what we see happening in the understory as well. So as I mentioned, the Quebec's forests are very different to Alberta's, but we definitely do think there's a lot that can be utilized from the work that's been done in Quebec to try and inform what may or may not happen in different ecosystems in Alberta. And as in BC, historically the focus has more been on those caribou habitat attributes, and there's often a lack of data on the actual caribou response and also on these characteristics that are important for apparent competition. And I said I'd talk a little bit about zonation. So in Quebec, there's been a lot of discussion and implementation too of this triad approach, where the landscape is kind of divided up into areas which are focused very much on ecological protection, and others which are a mix of some level of timber harvest and some focus on ecological concerns. And then finally, areas where you have very intensive silviculture, where you'd really try and focus on producing as much timber as possible. So really, the interesting thing here is that a number of people who we interviewed brought this up and said, well, one thing that will likely happen if you implement alternative systems in caribou range is that you're likely to lose some timber volume. And might intensive silviculture in other less ecologically sensitive areas be an option to make up for some of that timber volume loss? So that's kind of where this discussion comes in. So moving on to Alberta, there's not a lot of alternative silvicultural system trials in Alberta that focus on caribou, but nonetheless, there are a lot of interesting trials which provide data that could be used or repurposed to try and answer some of the questions surrounding alternative systems. And there's just a few highlighted on this map. There's many more, of course, and I'll take you through a few different trials which have some interest from this perspective. So the EMEN project is in northwestern Alberta. It's actually in part of the Chinchaga Caribou Range. And it's this quite large-scale experimental project looking at different levels of retention. And you can kind of think of the higher levels of retention as essentially a form of partial harvest. And the really great thing about this study is that there's very detailed understory vegetation data as well as overstory. And that's quite unusual. That's not something that you typically see. And of course, that's really useful from the perspective of trying to assess how the understory responds to these different levels of harvest. And there's also some camera trap data as well, including of caribou moving through this area. And there's also unanalyzed terrestrial lichen data as well, which might be an opportunity. So this is a really nice project because it really provides that opportunity to kind of look back at this fairly long-term data set and see how these different treatments interact with that understory response, and ask whether there are thresholds that might exist in this system above which you wouldn't want to go in terms of minimizing that understory response. And then we also have a number of commercial thinning trials in Alberta. These are some aerial photos from West Fraser Hinton's trials. And theoretically, at least, thinning makes sense from a caribou habitat perspective because it opens up the canopy enough to actually favor lichen growth, but not so much as to actually kill them. And so it can be an opportunity to maintain those attributes which are important to caribou. And there have been studies in this area looking at whether that happens. And while there wasn't really an improvement seen in terms of lichen growth, there was maintenance. But what isn't really clear is whether caribou will continue to use these areas. And there isn't really any data on that. And so that's a big unknown, and something which really needs to be addressed in order to know whether these thinning treatments can be effective. And we also don't know that much really about how the understory will respond depending on the level of removal that you use and on the site conditions and the productivity. And of course, what you want to avoid with something like this is opening up the canopy in a more productive ecosystem and creating a big flush of early seal stage vegetation. So we also have this system called Understory Protection in Alberta, used in mixed wood stands, primarily aspen, white spruce. And it's used when you have an aspen overstory, you can remove the overstory, but protect the white spruce understory. And that understory can then go back, or continue growing, into a mature stand. And this is used in mixed wood stand management. And of course, mixed wood stands like this are not typically caribou habitat, but they're often interspersed or near to caribou habitat. And so they're really important because what happens in these stands actually affects caribou through apparent competition. So if we create a lot of early stage vegetation in caribou habitat or near to caribou habitat in mixed wood stands, we can really start favoring those other ungulates and bring those predators into areas where we don't want them. So one potential opportunity here is that when you do have a very well-established spruce understory, it can really suppress the aspen suckering and the growth of grasses and shrubs that you would expect after you remove aspen. And so potentially that can mean that you can have this area be used to have some harvest level, but you're not making it really good habitat for moose and deer. And underplanting as well may be another opportunity to kind of improve or maximize those effects where you don't have a really good spruce understory naturally available. So commercial thinning, is quite attractive from a commercial forestry point of view. It does provide often some flexibility in wood supply, and it can be a method of achieving larger diameter timber in a reduced time frame. And it may be effective too at maintaining caribou habitat attributes, but as I mentioned, we really need that additional knowledge about caribou response. And one thing that we heard is that there are a number of trials planned through FGRO on commercial thinning, and there really could be an opportunity to add a component to some of those trials that looks at some of those caribou specific components. I mentioned EMEND and that it has a lot of good data that could be used to better understand understory response to different levels of removal in partial harvest systems. And understory protection, hasn't really been looked at a great deal from the point of view of caribou, but maybe there are opportunities there to really suppress that browse coming back in some of those mixed wood stands. But it definitely will be limited by local conditions, and particularly what that understory actually looks like. You see a lot of variability, and so it's not always simple or even possible to apply this type of system. So before I move on to talk about things like the recommendations, I wanted to cover a couple of more general discussion points. And the first of these is access. And so in general, alternative silvicultural systems tend to require additional or longer term access, particularly if there's a need for multiple entries for a system. And there's kind of there's a risk here for forestry in terms of costs. It's obviously expensive to maintain and build roads, but there's also some risks here for caribou. And that is, we know that access into caribou range facilitates predator and prey movements, and that can increase that predation rate on caribou. And we also know that as soon as we have access into caribou range, it tends to get used, and often for other purposes, like for recreation. And there are ways of managing that. You can do access control and so on, but it certainly can be a challenge still. And one thing that we heard from a few different people in the interview process was that this is a really major trade-off and risk with any alternative systems, is managing that, that additional access that may be required. The second major point is around economics and costs. Clear-cut forestry in Alberta is really efficient. It's a very efficient way of doing forestry, and it makes sense in our landscapes. And alternative silvicultural systems are generally going to be costlier. There's the simple fact that if you do anything which involves a partial harvest, then there's obviously going to be a loss of volume there. And you can also generally expect that there's going to be some increased costs per meters cubed of volume that you produce as well. And often there's things like more complex block layout and maybe different equipment requirements, operator training and things like that. So these costs, of course, are going to vary a lot depending on different systems and so on, but it's definitely a risk for forestry and definitely a concern. And then there's also kind of this inherent risk for caribou with this as well, because if we are to assume that mill requirements stay the same, if we do reduce the amount of volume coming from an area that we would have clear cut in caribou range, then there's a need to make up for that volume elsewhere to maintain those requirements. And where that additional volume comes from is obviously really important, because if it comes from other areas of caribou range, we risk kind of decreasing the intensity of the harvest that we do, but increasing its extent. And that we don't really know what the impact would be, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that suggests that it wouldn't be a good thing for caribou. And so this is a big concern. But it also brings us back to that kind of zonation and intensive silviculture idea that maybe there are opportunities to do more intensive silviculture in other parts of FMAs that are less ecologically sensitive to make up for some of that loss. But it's certainly a big challenge and a big discussion point. So just to recap on some of these major points, so we definitely didn't identify any silver bullet solutions, and I don't think that will surprise anyone. Like, we probably wouldn't be here having this discussion if there were any like that. But what we did want to highlight was there are a number of different systems out there that have been used in different ways, and they certainly have opportunity and applicability to Alberta. But the key thing that we really try to highlight is that the results that you see from these different systems is really dependent on the local ecosystem, on the structure and the nature of the forest, on the site conditions, and also on exactly how treatments are applied. And you can see really different results depending on where you apply different systems and how you do it. And so you have to take a lot of care, because what works in one place might have negative effects in another. There's also this need to address multiple elements of this problem at the same time. So we have this really important apparent competition effect, and that predation really drives a lot of the declines that we see in caribou populations in Alberta. And so we want to minimize that understory response, minimize that habitat quality for those other ungulates. But at the same time, we're also trying to maintain some of that caribou habitat quality, maintain those lichens that they rely on. And we're also trying to minimize access. And the relative importance of these different factors can definitely vary depending on where you are in the province. So in much of the boreal, for example, the proportion of the land base which is managed for forestry is relatively low. And so often it's not so much caribou habitat which is limiting in those systems, it's much more the predation and the apparent competition. But in other areas, particularly areas that are more disturbed, like in the Little Smoky or in parts of the foothills, there's really also a limitation on caribou habitat itself, i.e. a place where caribou can be and can stay. And so there it's also really important to actually maintain and make sure we maintain enough area that caribou will continue to use. And so, perhaps one very caribou-centric option here could be a mixture of systems, including various forms of partial harvest, which are aggregated and have a single entry. And that would really serve to minimize a lot of those access concerns, but it would definitely come with some pretty significant costs. So that really brings me on to our kind of main recommendation, which is around a pilot study. And we see this as initially having a planning phase, somewhat similar in scope, I guess, to a miniature forest management plan, but with a refocus of those management objectives to be on these caribou outcomes, and then looking at all the other outcomes, including the timber supply coming out from that. And the key thing for us here was that we think there's a real need to go big and to do this at a large scale. And while local trials of different systems are really useful and important, what they can't do generally is have enough of an effect to see how caribou actually respond to different areas, and also see how those other ungulate species like moose and deer respond, and in turn those predator populations. And so we suggest looking to the harvest timing units, which are being developed in Alberta by forestry companies in order to facilitate the aggregated harvest approach, which Alberta is looking to take in caribou ranges. So we suggest that one or a number of these harvest timing units could be used, and kind of throughout this number of 20,000 hectares, but it could be much larger even, to do this. And the current assumption is that these aggregated areas would be clear-cut, but in this study, what we would see is you would switch that around, and you would instead have an aggregated alternative system where you would use a number of different systems in the area, depending on what's appropriate for the different forest types. And one thing that we heard a lot in our interview process was that there's often a kind of maybe a lack of collaboration or communication between different disciplines, and particularly between silviculture and kind of the caribou biology, wildlife biology side of things. And so we really wanted to highlight that there's a need to have that multidisciplinary aspect to this, in that biologists are very well placed to identify what some of those stand level vegetation objectives might be. And silviculturalists are really well placed to identify the treatments and the systems that would be appropriate to actually achieve those objectives. And then there's also a need to have those more operational foresters involved who can speak to the costs and the commercial applicability of these different systems and what would need to be done to make them work and what's actually practical. And so we really see this, this as an exercise which makes use of all those different skill sets, and then would lead to an implementation phase which would definitely need to have a really heavy monitoring component that looks both at the attributes of the habitat itself and the forest, but also on caribou response, other ungulate response and predators. And in some places in the province, we're actually quite well set up to do things like that because we already have really in-depth caribou monitoring programs, for example, with telemetry data. So I did just want to mention a few other recommendations that we have as well. So one thing that I've mentioned kind of throughout is this need to reuse, or this opportunity to reuse data from existing trials. And one thing that's clear is there's a lot of unknowns with these alternative systems and how they will turn out. But I think that given the need to act on caribou population declines, there's not really an opportunity to kind of wait for that perfect knowledge. There's a need to go out and to try things and to see what works. And one way in which we can do that more effectively is to really utilize some of that existing information and try to guide our work by using that. And there's also an opportunity to piggyback on some future trials as well by adding those caribou-focused components. And then I also talked about this kind of knowledge exchange. There's definitely, I think, a need to try and bring together these different fields a little bit more. And one thing that could be an opportunity to do that beyond this pilot study idea is perhaps do workshops, but also we had this idea of kind of a visual guide to what really good quality caribou habitat looks like in different places in the province, to try and help guide silviculture experts on ways in which you can actually maintain those attributes. And then finally, we have these kind of knowledge gaps, and one which is kind of an interesting one is this intersection of site conditions and productivity, the level of harvest or the type of harvest that you do, and the light conditions that actually result from the harvest that you carry out. And what we often don't know is exactly how those things will interact in terms of the understory response. And there may be, in different systems, there may be thresholds at which you can still have a harvest level which is meaningful, but minimize that understory response as well. And so there may be some opportunities to look at this, particularly through LiDAR, becoming much more available and cost effective. And it's really good for looking at canopy cover, and also through light models as well from silviculture. So that's about all I had. I think I talked a little bit more quickly than I expected, but that means more time for questions, I guess. So, thank you.